Salpietro, and I am the NCACES webinar committee member. On behalf of NCACES, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Infusing Love and Laughter into Counselor Education. We are so glad that you're here and we appreciate your support of NCACES. I want to just go over a couple things before we get started today. First, during the webinar, you can interact with our presenters by using the tools to the right on your screen, such as the chat box, and you can also react with emojis on the side. If you have any issues during the webinar with technology, first go ahead and try logging out of Zoom and then logging back in, because sometimes that fixes some of the glitchy issues. And then also, just to give you a heads up, today we will be recording this webinar, and due to the number of attendees that we're expecting, all questions and comments can be placed in the chat box, and at the end they'll be addressed. For those of you who are interested in receiving CEs for this presentation, there are a few things I just want to let you know ahead of time. So first, participants who are present for the full webinar are eligible for CEs. You'll receive a short survey via email to complete related to the webinar. After the CE coordinator receives your survey, you'll receive a CE certificate via email. This usually takes just about 1 to 2 weeks total. So today you'll likely receive the survey, and then in about 1 to 2 weeks, you'll actually receive the certificate. Finally, we have a lot of really great other webinars coming up, so we hope that you join us for those. And I will put a link to our website so you can see the days and titles of those, as well as check out our social media pages. And then if you have any questions, I'll put our direct email into the chat box as well, so that way you're welcome to email us if you do have any technical difficulties or questions. Finally, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We have Dr. Clark Ausloos with us. He's a clinical assistant professor at University of Denver and a licensed and board certified clinical and school counselor. His research aims to empower and promote ethical, affirming training and professional practices within counselor education programs and within clinical and school settings. And we also have Dr. Lena Salpietro who is an assistant professor at the University of North Florida and a licensed and board certified counselor. Her scholarly work focuses on gatekeeping and remediation in counselor education, the mental wellness and counseling experiences of LGBTQIAP+ people and counselors who have lost a client due to suicide. So welcome, Dr. Ausloos and Salpietro.
Thank you so much, Dr. Danielson. We appreciate that warm intro. We're very excited to be here. And so welcome all. I wanted to share a quick story that Dr. Salpietro didn't know I was going to share. So it's just called improvisation. I first met Dr. Salpietro in our master's program when we were getting our master's degree. And one of the first things that she did, she's a group presentation. And it was about ethics. It was related to ethics in some way, I don't remember. And the first thing she did was play a video of the TV show called The Office. There was a scene in that show where instead of singing "Let's Get Physical," which many of us might know that song, they sing "Let's Get Ethical." So she played that as a clip, and I thought, that is going to be someone I want to be friends with. And little did I know that we would become great friends, go through our doctoral program together, and now our colleagues, and work together a lot. And that got sentimental, and this is supposed to be funny. And okay, I guess that's the love part. Here we are. So what I'm going to do, you're like, what was that story? And why did I even come to this? I'm going to be sharing my screen. So please, I'm just going to put my chat over here. You know how it is when you have to rearrange everything. Just give me a second. Can you see the screen? Give me a thumbs up or some sort of signal. Those of you that are off camera, I'll use an emoji. Okay, thank you. Great, excellent. Well, here we go. So we have some guided presentations, our PowerPoint that we're going to use today. And we're happy to share this with you in some way. We're also happy to share our emails and for further discussion. I will share that I confess, and I think Dr. Salpietro will confess too, we're not experts. This is not our area of expertise regarding research or clinical research, but we are probably the funniest people we know. So therefore, that makes us qualified to do this presentation. That's all I'll say. I have a couple quotes that I wanted to start us off with that I wanted you to soak in. So these are just to soak in kind of and think about as we frame our presentation. So what is learned with laughter is learned well. Soak it in. And here's one that's related to love. When teachers teach with love, we are often able to enter the classroom and go straight to the heart of the matter, which is knowing what to do on any given day to create the best climate for learning. And that's from Bell Hooks. Okay, so just some quotes to frame us in our love and laughter presentation. So,
we just have a few things on the agenda today. Aside from listening to Clark's terrible jokes, we're going to talk about foundational principles of laughter and love and democratic education. We're going to learn the benefits of using these in our classrooms. We're going to acquire pragmatic strategies. So we'll explain some things that we do in our classrooms to infuse some of these things. And we're hoping to hear from you all once we do an activity of maybe how you've integrated some love or laughter into your classrooms.
absolutely. Yes, this can be as engaging or unengaging as you want, because obviously we are kind of unengaging. So let's talk about love first. Don't we want to talk about love? I think what's interesting is when we're doing this presentation, it was kind of like, we don't really, we're empathic as counselors and we use love in a way that seems kind of ethereal and not really defined well. What is love? Lena was like, maybe we should include a definition or two of like what love is, what is it? So I found a couple, and there's so many definitions to describe love that I found some that I think matches what the spirit of this related to counselor ed and how we can use this in our higher ed classrooms. So that would be like, warm attachment, enthusiasm, devotion to our craft, to our students, as well as unselfishness, loyal, and benevolent. Wow, I am actually all of those things all the time. Interesting. So yeah, I wanted to kind of share that as a definition to frame it. But I also wanted to connect this to, again, we're kind of using hooks as a framework here to what's called democratic education. And Hooks talks about that if we're using a democratic education framework, that is, in fact, demonstrating love. That is teaching with love. And so, she defines it as mutual partnerships, building a strong community in the classroom, having opportunities for healing, seeing students as a whole person. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, and then empowering our students in the classroom and outside, and liberating as well. So we're going to look a little bit more about what does democratic education look like, and connecting into teaching with love. So some of you may be already doing these things in your classrooms, and now you can kind of connect it and say that you're teaching with love and teaching in a bell hooks framework. So just to remind us about kind of how this can be compared to authoritarian education, right? Remember the days of sage on the stage. I always like saying that because it sounds cool. No longer, right? Because what this does is dehumanizes and shuts down folks. It's divisive. It can be repressive. There's this stigma that at times, only serious professors or the folks in academia teach in this way. Maybe it's less collaborative. So it devalues caring the teachers, it devalues service. Whereas in democratic education, we work to create closeness, sharing knowledge outside of the classroom and connecting our experiences to stuff outside these four walls, or these four Zoom walls. Cultivating joy. Doesn't that sound great? Like, it's awesome. Come on. Being open. And a lot of these things we do as counselors and as counselor educators anyway, because we do a lot of hopefully holistic education where we're speaking to the whole student, and also self-evaluation, which I think we do a lot in counselor ed as well. So that's a little comparison on why we're moving towards a democratic education, just some reminders. I also wanted to share that I think it's important to frame the educator. As part of this presentation, I'm going to share that my button recently became unbuttoned, and I'm going to button it back up. So if you think that I'm doing something strange, that's what's happening. And I think it's appropriate that I share that with you during this presentation, because it's not working. All right. So what I wanted to share here was, as educators, we can frame ourselves in a way that we are teaching with love. And what does that look like? So we're passionate and engaged in what we do. Some of that has to do with maybe taking time away from teaching so that we're better people and better humans and instructors when we come back to the classroom. Work without pay has value outside of higher ed and outside of counselor ed. And then commitment to service as well about students and asking yourself and asking them, what do you need in order to learn? How can I serve you? Things like that. Okay, so being present, remembering that learning is not goal-oriented. So again, this is a democratic type of education as well. Sense of humor is important, which we'll talk about in a second. And then again, that piece of grounding education with experience and also sharing your own, if appropriate or if needed, your own clinical and your own personal experiences as well. And I think we know that sometimes we have to process stuff that's uncomfortable, and that might happen in many of our counseling spaces in our classrooms. But that is also how we teach with love and get deep and grow. Oh, I hope you all are feeling good in your hearts right now. I wanted to share this other piece here that is the pedagogy of love, and Yin et al. Talked about these themes that are actually pretty similar to or congruent in some way with Hook's themes of teaching with love in the classroom. So if you're looking at these themes, we see a lot of overlap. We see acceptance of diversity. We see building a strong classroom community, intimacy, in a way of closeness, right, with our students, or intimacy in building strong relationships with our students, bonding as well. So bonding with our students, sacrifice in the sense of, in this study, they were talking about sacrificing things for your students, for your job, because you love your job. Now, of course, there's the caveat of burnout and doing things, too many things, right? But these themes were found: kindness, being familiar with your students. So I think that not only recognizing that, remembering their names, but knowing things about them. And we'll talk more about how we can learn from our students to better love them in the classroom. Forgiveness as well, forgiveness of things that happen in the classroom, and passion in what you're teaching about. Yeah, so these resources are great, and please check them out to read further about some of these major theories about love. Is this me?
So
Oh,
I think it's both of us.
okay, great.
I mean, you can take it if you want, but I think Clark and I wanted to share some of the ways that we integrate love into our classrooms. And I know for me, I'm in my third year, and at the beginning of my career, it was very important for me to be like very strict, like have my rules, have my policies. And I still think that's important for a lot of different reasons. But I found that there's ways to still have a rigorous policy, right, that really is, holds students to high standards and, creates those kind of like ethical and professional boundaries that we want to create, but still infuses kind of that love and trust. So one way that I do that is in regards to like extensions on my assignments. So in my policy, in my syllabus, students, we have a due date. I don't accept anything after the due date. Otherwise it's a 0. But students at any time, as long as it's a reasonable amount of time before the assignment is due, is allowed to email me and ask for an extension, however long they need, with no questions asked. I don't ask them why, I don't ask for proof. I do this as a way to say that, like, I trust you all, take care of yourselves first, but also just to encourage communication. The other practice I started that's probably one of what I thought would be just one of the simplest things I did, but probably have been the most impactful in the way that I can relate to my students, is I do a pre-course survey. And one question that I ask is there anything you would like me to know about the circumstances in which you are learning this semester? Which sounds pretty broad. But I found out that some of my students were homeless, some had to drive 2 hours to get to school, and were having difficult times with parking, like all of these issues that some things I could provide resources to that helped my students feel cared for and attended to. I wouldn't have been able to find out unless they came and told me, or if I would have asked them directly. So infusing those kind of things that show that we care about their lives outside of the classroom, I found has really increased my ability to relate to my students.
Dr. Salpietro, I was going to mention too, I actually have copied your pre-course survey, and I use a lot of the same kind of questions to gather information. And I found that's been really helpful in what you're saying too, finding folks that have family obligations. And again, this goes back to loving our students, teaching holistically, where they are people outside of the classroom. So learning about those students who, I've had comments like, You may see me check out of a class for 10 to 15 minutes with my camera off because I am, taking care of a child or something like that. So these are things that we want to know about that I think we can ask in this pre-course survey. I actually ask for any scheduling conflicts in ahead of time too, so that can be a smoother process. And then of course, salient identity factors, including pronouns, if they're comfortable sharing those pronouns in front of others in the class, and things like that. So see what else here that we want to talk about. I think another thing is, a lot of times I do this at the beginning of class where we'll talk about like what day is it. So we'll either have like kind of some laughter over National Cheeseburger Day or whatever it might be, and we talk about things like that. But we also bring up and make sure to are intentional with talking about and celebrating days of importance, days of remembrance. Black History Month, these types of things are important to address at the beginning of session. And then I also like to ask students, is there any special days now that are happening for you? Like, is it anniversary, birthday, or are you having a bad day? So we can check in those ways that that we're demonstrating love.
I think maybe one thing you do, Clark, and I know I do, is especially when my students start their practicum semesters, they're all like having existential crises and mental breakdowns like every day. So I start every single class, I block out time and change a lot of my teaching schedule just to like hold space for 15 minutes if they want to share like how they're feeling or how they're dealing with things. I've had times where we've just sat 15 minutes in silence. And you could see just kind of like the relief of being able to just like hang out for a second or be able to talk about how they're feeling in regards to the larger things that are going on versus having to schedule a separate appointment with me. So I think having those like designated times too have been helpful in kind of creating that environment where students know that we do care about them, just like we do care about our clients, even though we're not supposed to. We care about our students, even though we're maybe not supposed to.
Exactly. And I think you make me think about when I check in with my students, I want to also engage. Like, so these are great ideas, but also let's engage with our students and see where they're at. So, I'll say, I'll ask students about where we're at. Do we want to either have 3 minutes of music and play the music, or do we want to have some moments of mindfulness, perhaps, where we kind of use a YouTube guided mindfulness exercise and so we kind of gauge where we are as a class and then use an intervention that meets them where they are. Okay. Now we're going to get into some laughter. So also, I'm going to really check, is there a laughter emoticon? There is, right? Is that the crying one? So whenever you're laughing, which hasn't been often, I'm really failing at this. Thank you, Megan. Appreciate that. Whenever you can, oh, thank you, Jenny. So now it's working. Just make sure, throw in a laughter now and then as an engagement. Thank you. Because it's like a tough crowd. It's like a stand-up comedian. The crowd's just really not getting it, not doing well.
The jokes get worse the less attention that we get. So if you want to keep the jokes good, we need the attention.
Absolutely, we do. And I'm an only child, so I need the most. Let's talk a little bit about what the research says, and here it is. There's not a lot of empirical evidence related to humor in higher ed classrooms, and specifically in counselor education research or classrooms. We do see stuff that frequently involves younger children and might be teaching at different levels. And so we're excited to kind of dig into this further now that we did this presentation and see what's out there. We also have some folks joining us, I think, at this presentation that might have some experience with this. And so we welcome your engagement at the end of this as well. But that's what does the research say? Here's some theoretical underpinnings. And also, if you like the word underpinning, raise your hand. I just like writing it. It sounds cool. Do I know what it means? Yeah, I think.
So before I talk about some of like the instructional theories in regards to humor, let's first just do a quick refresher on like what makes things funny. So there's over like 20, I think 30 different theories of why people laugh, but I found a really good resource, this Warren article that kind of condensed them all down into just about I think it's 5 different types of humor. Because if we're going to make people laugh, we have to know how we're going to do that, right? So the first is surprise. So we find something funny when it's different than what we would expect. In the very limited instructional, humor that we're able to find in the research, surprise is often used in regards to whenever an instructor just tells a joke, because I think a lot of students don't expect us to tell jokes. So you're probably not actually funny. They just don't expect you to be saying anything funny. So the surprise element of it. And I can't say this word, simultaneity. I'm not going to say it again, that one. This one I think is actually really well suited for counselor education because everything we do is contradictory and there's always a it depends component to it. So we find things funny when there are 2 things that kind of like don't match up or 2 things that can be conflicting. So while this is not funny, one thing that is conflicting about what we do is like self-disclosure. It is, a lot of people think that unhelpful won't do anything helpful. Some people think absolutely we need to do it. So 2 things can be true at the same time. And if we can make that humorous, is how we can engage people. Superiority is kind of like an old Aristotle, Plato kind of thing and kind of energy. People still do find this funny, but this is when we think that we are kind of like better than someone else or something else, and we find that kind of like engaging and humorous. So if you see like an old high school enemy on Facebook and their life is just spiraling and you think that's funny, that would be an example of what a superiority type of funny would be. Probably what most people think about me in my Facebook page. Violation appraisal. This is when we find something threatening that's funny, typically as long as it's not happening to us. So if anyone's familiar with the show like Jackass or America's Funniest Home Video, often had a lot of videos where people were getting hurt. And there's a part of us that finds that funny because it's some type of like risk factor to it. The final one is benign. And this one's a little bit different. So this is kind of that subjective idea that like something's harmless or okay or acceptable, and therefore we can laugh about it. It usually has like other conditions that allow us to then make the benign appraisal. So like a misattribution or some type of like alternative norm would then allow us to be like, oh, this is something kind of benign. I can find that funny. So an example of this would be like, let's say I'm playing with my niece and I'm pretending to be like the tickle monster. This is funny to her because although monsters are scary, she knows me. So there's a sense of safety, right? And it's also funny and playful because monsters don't tickle, right? So it's kind of this idea of like, okay, this is safe. I can see this is not threatening because I know this person and they're doing something silly. However, let's say if Clark were to try to be a tickle monster to my niece, right? He doesn't know my niece. He also looks like a monster. So that's going to allow her to not appraise this as something safe and neutral, right? And she'll likely become terrified and cry and be traumatized for the rest of her life. So it's that element of trying to find something that's a little more like safety matter about it. Yeah, don't tickle anyone. But this is where a lot of like dad jokes and puns kind of fall in, this kind of like silly, carefree type of humor. So there's kind of a few theories, but most of them come down to this first one, which is this instructional humor processing theory. This aims to understand like why are some instructor jokes funny and increase learning, and why are some instructor jokes not funny and don't attribute to learning at all. So kind of the main findings were in relation to the relevance and the appropriateness. So humor that was related to the content of the course and was appropriate, therefore not deprecating towards other or not offensive towards other, that is going to result in better learning outcomes and more engagement in learning. If we have a joke that's not relevant, but is still appropriate, so let's say the instructor participates in some type of like self-deprecating joke, right? So try to like ease the room a little bit. This doesn't necessarily improve learning outcomes, but it does improve engagement, right? Usually because of that surprise factor, because students don't expect you to be funny. So when we're making jokes, especially if we want students and we want to use humor to help improve learning outcomes, we have to make sure that it's relevant to the content. That doesn't mean we can't throw in jokes here or there. And that's where I think the emotional response theory comes in, as well as the latter half of that first theory. That even if it's not directly related to the content, if we are doing jokes that are appropriate, right, and aren't offending anyone or putting anyone down, it does encourage students to become more engaged, not necessarily learn what we're teaching better, but they are more likely to kind of approach and be engaged and listen and participate in class, because we are producing serotonin and dopamine by making them laugh. We don't want to do this too much, but we want to make sure we're balancing of, okay, some jokes related to content, but also maybe some jokes to get the students more engaged in the actual process. And I'll talk about some scenarios and some things you can do in some of those areas as well.
I think there's also one that is related to kind of having a release of tension in a sense. I think one that we found in our research was called like anxiety theory or something, where, right?
Anxiety
So
arousal.
Arousal, thank you. Yeah, where this released that tension that was built up. So
I think I already touched on a few of these, but Clark will reiterate some of these as well. It increases motivation and learning as long as it's content related. One thing that it does is reduce psychological distance. So there's this concept called immediacy, and this is one of the really big ones in instructional research, that if an instructor is immediate in regards to verbal and nonverbal behaviors, students are more likely to engage and therefore likely to learn better. Verbal engagement or verbal immediacy would be something like calling students by their name or responding to them directly. Nonverbal would be making eye contact, things like this. This brings the instructor and the students closer together. What humor can do is expand upon that even more. So it kind of reduces what they call the psychological difference between the instructors and the students, kind of breaking down some of those walls and making you seem a little bit more relatable. Students who have instructors who use humor have been shown to be more likely to talk to the instructor and reach out to them outside of class, which I think is really great. It helps decrease their overall stress. You can use it to help with like problematic behaviors, and we'll talk about some examples of maybe you can use to address that. If a student is, acting in a way that's unhelpful to the classroom. I use, if anyone's ever seen the Snoop Dogg video about the syllabus, I use that quite a bit in regards to problematic behaviors of my students not reading the syllabus. So it's a way of, if you don't know what it is, it's Snoop Dogg telling students to read their syllabus, and it's quite funny. But it's a way to, if students are not, again, doing what you would like them to do, instead of telling them over and over again, you can use a humorous component that they're probably more likely to remember.
And really, too, it does humanize us as educators, as it reduces the distance between us as educators and students. And in that way, as we're more humanized, and this leads to the other outcomes, like Lena was saying, where students are more likely to reach out to you outside of class, and thus having better communication and maybe increased skills in some way. So it is appropriate in the educational process. We're here to tell you to be funnier. And the crowd goes wild. Excellent. A couple other pieces we wanted to touch on. Some research shows that some instructors got better evaluations when they used humor. You should see mine, off the chart. It makes the learning environment super enjoyable and can for folks. Also, instructors that are high in humor in one study were perceived as more competent. So that's why I try to be as funny as possible. So students think that I know what I'm doing. Also, we talked about this before, it's actually easier to recall humorous information. It may help with knowledge and comprehension, but there's some studies that talk about, we're looking at Bloom's taxonomy, that talk about perhaps not increasing application, which is interesting. Humor at the start of lectures, and this is kind of a little bit what we talked about before, is great for attention grabbing, beneficial to student learning. It can decrease stress. That's why I always try to start off with some activity. And even in our limited, 100-minute classes, I think that even if I'm taking that time, that's important. So student learning is more effective, and they can learn more. So humor should not add additional cognitive load to students. So it should be in line with content and not make them overloaded cognitively with your humor, which I try not to.
So there are a lot of different types of humor. You can Google, and there's witty, dark humor, satire, right? And I'm not going to go through all of these different types. But when we think of humor, we're kind of thinking about three different things. We're thinking about like a sense of humor, which is someone like ability to amuse others and then what you find funny. There's another type of humor that's like a joke, right? So something that stimulates it. So I'm producing humor by telling a joke. And then there's the psychological state where we're like humorous. So we're the recipient of humor and we're laughing and things like that. So when we're being humorous or trying to have a sense of humor in the classroom, it's important that our intentionality and what we're trying to achieve with it is kind of at the forefront. So let's say you're trying to increase the mood and energy of the class. You walk into the class and everyone's kind of down and out. You could use topical humor or witty humor. Topical humor is something that's related to like current pop culture. So one that I was using last semester that my students got sick of eventually, but I thought it was funny, was talking about how the new Taylor Swift album came out and that my clinical practice referrals have increased 40% because of that, because of her music, right? So something to kind of get people laughing, kind of break the ice at the beginning of the class. Let's say you're trying to make the class more interesting or engaging. This is something that Clark's very good at. You could use wordplay or puns, right? Try to add little small jokes in there that maybe doesn't make the content more interesting, but will engage students a little bit more.
Can I jump in as an example right here?
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to blow past it so you wouldn't give one, but
I could
yeah.
tell, so I'm going to jump in because you're really rude. I like to use word puns. For example, when I'm doing activities that I think the students maybe not super enjoy, I like to call them fun-tivities. And so I say, are you ready for a fun-tivity? And so they get kind of, grown, but they laugh, and it lightens the mood a little bit. And just that little bit of language change, I think, can help. Because then they participate and they're really engaged in the activity. I was trying to think, there's other things. We do a fishbowl of counseling where I am the client or student, and they are all playing the counselor at one point at a time, and I call that Pop Counsel. They love it. I made a graphic called, and it says Pop Counsel, and I say it's Pop Counsel time. So it's we can get creative. So what else, Dr. Salpietro?
We can also use humor to decrease anxiety about like an assignment or a skills demonstration. So I'll use like physical humor when I'm talking about skills demonstrations or trying to decrease anxiety, where I'll over exaggerate what it means to not be present in the room, slouch over, kind of over exaggerate so students feel more comfortable about their own body and how it's presenting in the counseling session. I'll use a lot of like anecdotal humor when it comes to assignments or skills demonstrations. I'm sure you all remember being in your master's programs and just wanting to decrease into a ball of dust when you had to perform your skills in front of anyone. And so telling just a small anecdotal story about how you felt during that time or an embarrassing thing that happened to you in your first skills demonstration can kind of alleviate some of that anxiety. The last thing we can kind of use is, I think deadpan and dry humor is a little bit harder to use at times as an instructor, but it can be really useful at certain times. So I have a lot of students who are really, I would say, perfectionistic. Like they want to get every single point on every single assignment and will ask me questions like, if I don't say this part of the informed consent, am I going to get points taken off? And so deadpan humor can be helpful in lowering people down a little bit by saying, yes, I'm intentionally looking for reasons for you all to fail. I want you all to fail and I don't want you to be here anymore. So I'm going to take points off for everything. Right. So really over exaggerating, keeping it pretty straight faced can help students kind of like, again, come down a level.
I have one more example I was just thinking of. I remember learning this, and I teach this to students as well in certain conditions, but linking content to mnemonic devices and acronyms and things like that. Students I have to this day will come back and say they remember this in using it as a suicide screener, that we use Pimp Dad. So I've taught that in courses before where, Pimp Dad, and each one stands for plan, intent, mean, previous attempt. So like, so they can learn from it, but also they're going to remember Pimp Dad because they had a little chuckle about it in some way. And so, making things kind of funny can help them remember. I feel like
for motivational interviewing, I use one that's darn cats for change talk, but I can't remember what it stands for off the top of my head, but they love darned cats.
Oh, I really want to know what that is now. Okay.
I think it's like desire.
Well, we don't
attitude. I'm not gonna say it until it's off.
Okay, great. Here we go.
I think both of us has touched on this, and I'm sure you all are aware of this, but we always want to make sure that we reiterate that humor should never be directed at students in a harmful way. We're not here to make fun of students or put students down. I have students that I know well that I can tease a little bit. I know Clark well. I have no problem teasing him, but we really shouldn't be using our humor towards our students, and making sure we're not using excessive humor. If we're constantly making jokes of things, I think especially in the mental health profession, it can have the complete exact opposite of what we want it to have. I think it's okay to joke about some mental health aspects, right? I think it helps lighten the mood. It gets us talking about sensitive topics, but if we use it to avoid, then we're teaching our students to avoid having these conversations and instead putting up this defense mechanism of humor. So making sure that we're not using it to enforce any stereotypes, we're not making any student or any culture the butt of any jokes, and that we're using it in a good-natured way. Typically, the best way to avoid doing any of this is to think of your jokes ahead of time, or think of how you're going to use humor ahead of time. I'm bad at that, so I just do whatever I think of in the moment, but trying to keep these things at the forefront. Got anything to add to that, Clark?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the culture dependent humor too, and just this piece of that keeps coming to mind with all of this, with love and laughter and humor in the classroom, of you know, just keeping in check, are the things that I'm saying, are the jokes that I'm saying framed in a Western way? Would someone maybe not understand the joke or what I was saying in class, based on their own experiences and cultural identities? So I struggle with, then how do I, how do I make sure that my jokes are universal in a sense, or is that even possible ever? So these are thoughts that come to mind about like just considering cultural, sensitivity at all times. And I don't know if I have an answer, if I just kind of had a question for the ether. So you're welcome. I did want to touch on, and I'm not going to go through each one of these. We are going to each take for the next, no, I'm kidding, for the next hour, you'll take each one of these scales. I wanted to share this article, Casu and Grimigny from 2014. It's included in the references, but it does have a wide variety of different types of scales that measure types of sense of humor, and humor orientation, how you use humor to cope, and what kind of styles of humor that you use. So you could use these with yourself or with clients or with students. Caveat, I have not used all of these, so please don't say, well, this one dude said to use this, and it's not like super valid to use, and obviously make safe choices with these assessments and screeners. But I thought that was cool that we can measure humor. Look at that. Obviously, I would score highly on all of these. I know that was the question that was coming up later.
Mm-hmm. So this is just where we had a few more examples of some of the humor that we use in the classroom. I think we covered some, so we won't go over all of them. But you'll see the picture on the right. A lot of studies have been shown that if instructors don't remember their students' names, right, it decreases engagement, and students are, likely to give you worse evaluations. The problem with that is I'm terrible at names. It doesn't matter what I do, I just can't remember them. And the only thing that really helps me is fun facts. And I know everyone hates fun facts. So one way that I use memes is to kind of like broach that, of using a meme that shows that people roll their eyes at fun facts, and also using a meme you can see on the bottom that shows that I'm bad at names. And so it's a way to communicate these two things to students in a way that's funny, that they have less, I think, like angst in regards to going around and telling the fun facts to the group. I also do group norms in my class. At the beginning of every semester, we sit down and we decide how do we want to interact with each other, and we make norms up together. One that I've actually used in my diagnosis class that's been super helpful is what we call weeds. So if any of you have ever taught diagnosis, you know that students ask a lot of very specific questions that are not typically helpful, right? They'll ask like, well, what if in this situation they do this, this, and this, would this happen? So my students, I let them know up front, I tell them the story behind it, that if there's a question that's way out in the weeds, anyone at any time is allowed to go weeds. The question is not relevant. Students laugh. No one really takes offense to it. And if they really want that question answered later, they can come up to me after class. So it's a way to kind of let students know that that question's not helpful, but it's too far out in the weeds. Let's reorient and come back to the content.
Yeah, I love that. I was thinking about going back to the introductory part of class, like before you can even meet students, of using humor. I do that in that pre-course survey. I ask those specific questions, and at the very end, I have a question that asks, which of the following shows Dr. A's hair as the best, or in which photo does Dr. A's hair look the best? And then I put 3 actual photos of myself, and then there's a picture of a dog with a wig. And most students choose the dog with the wig. So right from the get-go, they know that maybe I have a little bit of a sense of humor and that they're going to have fun in the class in some way. But I put it at the end, and I always wonder what they think. So can't wait to. That was one example. I also like to, as in a self-disclosure way, I think it can be helpful for building community when we share things about ourselves appropriately that could be funny. Like, I think a lot of, maybe we'll talk about this in a second, having us revisit sometimes certain parts of our childhood can be humorous for folks. Of course, paying attention to folks that maybe didn't have the best childhood experiences, but I will share, for example, pictures of myself as a 9-year-old in my Halloween costume, just to get everybody going if we're nearing Halloween, or invite anyone else to do the same. So that's another way to kind of embarrass us all, have a laugh, have a sense of universality. What else, Dr. S?
I do check-ins and rounds as well. 2 that I kind of do quite a bit is asking students to go around and say what their most embarrassing AIM screen name or social media handle or email handle was, so we can all again have a good laugh. I also like to make students fight. That sounds terrible, but I mean it in a fun way. I'll ask questions like, would you rather fight 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? And then 2 people have to debate their sides. Then a way to kind of ice break in the beginning of session or in the beginning of class.
And who won that one? I wonder what they picked.
Oh, definitely the horse-sized duck versus the 100 horses. It's just too many. 100's way too many.
Okay, that's fair.
But they get into it. They talk about like how they would take it down. It's great.
I like this. I like that idea. We have a couple others here that we'll talk about too. Like some of these we talked about. Funtivities. There we go. Some of these you can do virtually or in person. Showing and tell. Some of these we probably already know. Show and tell can be either in person, taking something that they have near them and kind of talking about it, so you can learn a little bit more about them if they're comfortable with that. Or of course, if you're virtual, showing something that's near you. This large jug of mixed nuts to get me through the day is what I have. So it helps, create some space and some bond as well. Act and react is actually an activity that is kind of fun. And I'm going to speak from a virtual point because I teach in an online setting. I'll have students send me in a private message a situation like, my dog just got off the leash or whatever. And then basically, long story short, someone else in the course is going to see that. I'm going to send that to them, and they're going to act in a way like as if they lost their dog on a leash, and then they're going to show us to the class, and we're going to kind of guess like what's going on in this situation. So it can be fun. It can be, if you find folks are really not engaged, maybe it's not the right activity, but it can get people laughing and having fun. Remembering our younger selves, I kind of talked about. I also like to play music at the start of my courses. So I start my course, and often I'll be playing a song as the class starts and dancing, mostly because I'm trying to be like an Ellen. But also I think that, I've had students come on and just dance with me. And I also have students at the beginning of the class put in a song that they like, one of their favorite songs, and I make a playlist of our class. And so I will play our playlist of our class at the beginning of each class for a little bit to create some community as well. Yeah, and some other check-ins, icebreakers. 3 professionals is just another icebreaker of saying like what's something that's on your mind that's about professional, maybe what's something's on your mind that's personal and appropriate to share in class, and what is something that you're curious about. So yeah, Dr. S, anything there?
I think the only other activity I do is I have students in one day in class, everyone will bring in a therapy related meme. and we'll put them all up on the screen. And then we have to discuss why it's funny, to kind of break down the social cultural aspect of it, and then why it's either appropriate or not appropriate for a therapist to actually do. So there was a big trend, I think it's still actually going, of my therapist said, that would be fake conversations between a client and a therapist aimed to be humorous. We would sit there and laugh, but also kind of deconstruct and take it a more ethical route of like, okay, how can we use this humor to actually learn about some of the content and why this is funny and break down the humor behind it. That's all I got.
Yeah, love that. Love that. Good. So we would like to just open it up to have some discussions on, it doesn't have to be the specific question. It feels too academic after all of this laughter and love here in this room. But if there's anything that you have as suggestions, things you do, or if there's something that you saw today that you or heard about that is making you curious about using or looking more into for your specific classes. So feel free to, oh, I was just going to say that. Okay, thank you, Jenny, right on it. Feel free to put some questions in the chat or any comments or any jokes that you think are funny, and we will rate them. All right, here we are.
I have one thing that I can share. I kind of went old school. Like, I think back in 5th grade, we used to have this competition where you take a waste paper basket and like crunch up a piece of paper as a basketball, and you have to answer a question, or whoever gets the ball in first. And so we kind of did that in my counseling methods class as a kind of a review for the final coming up. I just asked them some questions, and you had to make the basket first in the waste paper basket before you could answer, and you were on teams. And so they had a lot of fun with it, and it was just a way to get them up and moving and playing around a little bit. And I suppose there's some ways that you can do that virtual, of course, with different tools like rolling dice or spin boards or something, but they liked it.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that. I love that. I stopped sharing, so anyone can jump on in.
So I am a director of our community-based training clinic in our program, which I know not all programs have, but something that I do in our student workspace where they write all their notes and are real busy and anxious in prac. Usually once a week I'll go in, and on one of the whiteboards I'll write some kind of poll. This week's poll was, what's your favorite conspiracy theory? And so then people be just writing on the whiteboard their favorite conspiracy theories, and then I'll walk in and they're definitely talking about it. Last week was a poll on if they thought birds were real or not.
They're not.
I'm confused by that, and I'm going to talk later. You need to talk later about that.
Oh yeah, I got it. Don't worry. They're all robots. Look it up.
Okay.
1970s.
All right.
Have you ever seen a baby pigeon? No one has.
I'm so confused right now. Dr. Burks mentioned in the chat that they use a lot of storytelling in class. So sometimes sharing yourself embarrassing stories can be in ethics, since it can be dry. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That's another example of things that I do in my ethics class as well as in prac. So we record all of our sessions, and usually at the beginning when they're really nervous, I'll let them know hey, as long as you're not taking off your pants, or your client's not taking off their pants, you're doing really good, because it's really awkward because now it's recorded, and now I have to see it and see you without your pants, and they usually are laughing by the end. So just kind of but also for real, please don't do it.
But for real, don't. Yeah.
Yeah, but for real.
One thing I wanted to share too, just briefly, is that I think the biggest thing about all of this for me was realizing as a new counselor, educator, and professional, that I could be myself and be funny and still be professional. And I think that those identities were really hard for me to incorporate because I didn't think people would take me seriously, or I wasn't a stoic sage on the stage. And so this has really helped me be myself as well. Not as this is about me, but I'm just sharing my experience. Dr. Burks, do you have your hand raised? I see.
Yeah, I was going to type it all in the chat and I just was like, this is too long. I'm not doing it. So I just wanted to share, in practicum, I usually do like a fears in a jar activity. And when they pull, they're supposed to read it and then also, or they put all of their fears in the jar, but then they all read them and then they share their, like how they would go about that thing, whatever the fear is. But I've shifted it over the years to just talk about the worst thing that they could do with the fear. And that has led to a lot of laughter and conversation and them being really comfortable with each other.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing this. Like, these are all ideas that I'm like, all right, I'm gonna take these. Yeah. I'm also seeing in the chat that like Laura uses mirroring improv activities before doing any mock counseling because mirroring, it's awkward and goofy. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Lifespan, it's great to share mostly developmentally appropriate experiences. Right, I love that, Ellen. Yeah, great point too, right? Like just specifically lifespan, because we can consider from, childhood on, and we can maybe share things that are embarrassing or funny. I've never had anything like that happen. Like when I was reading in front of church and my voice cracked. I'm over it. But Susan, Dr. Long talks about humor as a cognitive break and how it can be used to stimulate learning as well. I love that. Oh, look, I also, Dr. Long mentioned that a group norm is that students are expected to laugh at her jokes as well.
Love that.
So, is that a group? I'm curious, Dr. Long, if that was a group norm that was created collaboratively or by you only. So, Lisa, I saw you had your hand up. Oh, you're muted, Lisa.
Jessica, when you were sharing about something with the ethics, it brought to mind like kind of the worst thing that could happen. And one time I had a disastrous class with role plays. It was like their very first time role playing, and somehow I ended up with like a student trainee crying, the mock session client crying. They were like leaving the rooms, and all the rest of the students were looking at me, and I'm like, look, as long as I'm not crying, everything is still good. And so it was a nice humorous way to sort of break all the tension with what's happening.
Yeah, great example of diffusing and kind of just letting that situation. Yeah, Jody. You're muted too, Jody, but you can unmute and then talk.
There we go. The conversation about as long as you're not taking your pants off made me laugh, because in our clinic at one point, we had a woman who had pretty severe dementia, who was a client, and she thought she was in a doctor's office. So I heard my practicum student walking into the room going, "Oh, I'm not that kind of doctor. Put your pants back on." And, and it just reminded me, you never know what's going to happen in the clinic,
You never know. That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Jody. That's awesome. Yeah, and I appreciate that comment too. You shared, Jody, in the chat of if we're supposed to be genuine and model that we should be able to be our hilarious selves if we are. Only if you are. If you're not funny, don't try to be. I hope you got that out of this presentation. I'm kidding.
I always tell my students that I'm hilarious. So if they're bored in class, it's really on them,
I like that. I like that. Is there anything else that's coming up for folks about using love, laughter? Oh, I'm sorry about that, Dr. Burks. And then there's a lot of laughter. Maybe Dr. Salpietro and I can also put our emails in the chat for folks if they ever want to contact us.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Long, I see that you have your hand raised.
I do. I'm curious about your perspectives on when humor, or who can use humor, and how that will be perceived. I know you mentioned, Dr. Ausloos, that
your evaluations are through the roof, which I guess we'll all just have to take your word for it. But I'm curious if our own identities would influence maybe how students would experience the use of humor, if it would be distracting, or perhaps we wouldn't be seen as quote unquote credible or something like that. Is that making sense? Kind of those considerations on who can be humorous, who can, and have it be to their pedagogical benefit.
Well, I think, yeah, I love that question, because I feel like, specifically, as I said before, like someone who's new and also who presents young as a young person, I feel like at first I thought I couldn't really use humor because of that piece, and also kind of the expectations of like professional, what is professionalism, and so I also would be curious to look at what this looks like, you know, as I am a cisgender white male, using humor in the classroom, and what that is like versus other folks of other identities, and how they will be perceived by students. So I think you're bringing up a point that I don't have a great answer to, but I love that you are curious about that.
I know I came across a few studies on gender that I think they did one of those studies where they did the exact same jokes but changed the demographics information on it. And if you were, I think it was only cisgender men and cisgender women that they did the study on, but cisgender men were perceived as funnier. And I think we're more likely to be like rated positively comparatively to the cisgender women. But that's the only study I remember coming across in regards to like instruction.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I was curious about that, so thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And like I said, we're not experts, so we can dive. We'll probably do some future research. I'm just trying to look at the chat. I guess I can't talk and look at the same time. Anyone else? Does anyone else have tried texting while you're talking to someone else and they're talking at you and you have to write a text? Can't do it. How do you cite the jokes? Okay, more importantly, last question. How do you cite the good jokes from the presentation? You cite them by my last name or Dr. Salpietro's last name. So whoever kind of said the joke and was funniest, you can cite that person.
If you can find any good jokes from this presentation. I don't know if there's many.
And sift through them. Yeah.
And I think that's our time. I appreciate you all. This was fun, and it was fun putting this together. Again, by no means are we experts, but I think sometimes sharing anecdotal experience and how you have fun in your classroom can be really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We thought this was a good light topic and something that's important and can really foster a strong, counselor ed classroom. So thank you, everyone.